Terrorism. Militancy is when groups take up arms either in opposition to or in the absence of a local government. As a rule, the weaker regional governments are, the greater the propensity for militancy to expand, both in terms of geographic reach and the number of groups involved. Militants particularly thrive when the writ of governments ends, either due to lack of resources or actual state collapse, as the militants become the de facto rulers of specific territories. In war zones, such militants turn to guerrilla tactics to achieve their aims. Think of places like Afghanistan, Somalia, or Mexico's border regions where groups like the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, and the Gulf Cartel have managed to impose their own systems, or based on your politics, challenge an occupying force, at the end of a gun. These are all classic militant groups. Such groups thrive on disorder, and no system in world history has injected more order into the world than Bretton Woods. Because of the trade and alliance network, the vast majority of the world is at peace and prosperous. In the absence of war and poverty, and the presence of strong, well-funded local state apparatuses, there just are not nearly as many lawless or war-torn areas as there have been by historical standards. But as the Bretton Woods system gives way, this happy holiday from history will come to an end. Militancy will be a way of life in the failed states, a common occurrence in the decentralized states, and an irregular occurrence in many of the countries that face stability challenges. Militants are typically not friendly folks, and they do tend to target civilians from time to time, up to and including with terror attacks. A few likely examples of future guerrilla-sourced terrorism. Uzbek military forces will directly conquer the Tajik and Kyrgyz portions of the Fergana Valley. The region's mixed populations are obvious targets for guerrilla actions of all types. Angola's ninjas are slowly but steadily eradicating the non-Mbundu populations. The effectiveness of the Mbundu state's security apparatus leaves terrorism as one of the few tools remaining for the groups slated for elimination. Europeans, probably French and Italians, will take command of collapsed Libya in order to secure access to oil and natural gas supplies, and will bring civilians in to operate the Libyan energy industry. The Libyans who resist will have ample targets. Without capital to maintain high levels of agricultural productivity, the highland Bolivians will lack enough food to survive. Their only choice will be to raid the more fertile areas of the Bolivian lowlands. Farmers of the lowlands will be seen as prime targets. The failure of the European system will have a damning impact on the central governments of many states, allowing organized crime groups to exercise ever greater control over local affairs. In some places, such as Italy, expect local reigns of terror, as such groups overwhelm police forces and intimidate citizens into compliance. Russian, Persian, and Turkish power will sweep into the Caucasus, and Persian and Turkish power into Mesopotamia. Militants, locally spawned, Saudi-planted, Iranian-funded, and/or Russian-instigated, will resist by targeting everything from imposed governments to infrastructure. The Chinese central government has not just smothered the cultural expressions of its minorities, it has shipped Han Chinese into their homelands in order to work a genocide by assimilation and dilution. As Chinese economic growth falters and central control cracks apart, there are a wealth of Han targets for the restless and oppressed minorities. Some of these groups, most notably the Uyghurs of far western China, have little compunction about bringing the fight to the Han across the length and breadth of China. But terrorism is only one tool in the militants' playbook, and a rarely used one at that. When at war, militants attempt to strike when and where least expected and melt away. The whole idea is to avoid a direct slugging match with a conventional force which will probably have aircraft and artillery. Attacking a military force, regardless of the tactics used, is by its very definition not a terror attack. When dominating their own chunk of land, militants seek to actually be the government, so it matters what tools are used against the population. In both cases, terrorism, the use of violence by a non-state actor against civilians to achieve a political end, may be used, but it will not be the norm. And most important, such tactics would only be used locally. Militants' concerns, motivations, resources, forces, goals, and actions are all focused on their specific geographies. They are either resisting a superior force or attempting to carve out a piece of territory for themselves. They don't have the inclination or capacity to strike out cross-border except in the narrowest sense, much less across an ocean. This sort of over-there terrorism is not the type that generates fear in the West. Instead, it is the transnational sort that results in attacks like those of September 11th, 2001. The express goal of transnational groups such as Al-Qaeda is to instill fear in the general population in order to shape the policies of entire governments. For transnational terrorists, the use of terror tactics is not a tool selected for a situation, but instead both the means and the end. Such groups will still exist in the future, but they will face two obstacles to their operation that they currently do not. The first is a problem that transnational terror groups will find that they have in common with international migrants and multinational corporations. It will become harder to get around. Crossing international borders, much less oceans, will be a much grander undertaking than it is now. Just as economies and trade will regionalize and even localize, so too will militant activity. That leaves would-be transnational terror groups with a much constrained definition of transnational. The second constraint regards the sort of home territory that transnational terror groups require to operate. If the home government is too strong, the transnational groups are hunted down and exterminated. If the home government is too weak, the transnational groups have to expend their scarce resources and personnel to carve out and maintain their own piece of territory, just as more traditional militant groups would. That would leave them with few resources with which to hurl an operation into another hemisphere. Terror Groups' Goldilocks zone is a government that is on the edge, just strong enough to hold a territory together, but weak enough that it cannot actually control all of it. That's a very specific mix, and is represented by the decentralized layer on the global stability map. I'm not going to say anything as blanket as the United States doesn't need to worry about terrorism anymore. But the mechanics of the future are going to add an extremely thick layer of insulation to America's already impressive distance from the world at large. It's the same global stability map I've shown you before, but this time with an overlay for Muslim population concentrations. Not very many places in the Islamic world will have decentralized governments. Many of the locations that the West fears will become breeding grounds for terrorism, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, will become such security no man's lands that transnational groups simply will not be able to function. There will certainly be a few decentralized areas in sub-Saharan Africa, but not only are those Muslim populations in the continental interior, they are also thoroughly engrossed in local issues rather than hell-bent on launching operations in distant continents. When I look at this map, I see two areas of concern. The Pakistani vice. Pakistan looms large as the most critical area. In many ways, this was doomed to happen. As a consequence of the September 11, 2001 attacks, U.S. forces began heavy operations, first to root out Al-Qaeda and the Taliban from Afghanistan, and then to stabilize Afghanistan into some sort of form that could prevent Al-Qaeda's and the Taliban's resurgence. Considering that Afghanistan is both rugged and landlocked, it should come as no surprise that both tasks were difficult, with the latter proving all but impossible. At the time of this writing, the United States is attempting to negotiate the handover of authority to the local government that the Americans installed.